Ever notice light? Now, I know that we can't do it in here because we have windows and everything, but if we were in a building that was completely closed off, and then you turned off all the lights, and maybe you've been in that situation before, right? Where you're in this room that's just complete darkness, and then all of a sudden a little light comes on, right? Not a strong light, maybe not even a very bright light, but once a light comes on in complete darkness, it's somehow you see it. There's no escaping it. It's there. It's interesting, this idea of light in the darkness. And the fact is that right now, for many people, not necessarily literally, but metaphorically, they feel this darkness. Maybe for some of you, you've been feeling some of that as well. Maybe there have been episodes in your life that all of a sudden you feel like the weight of the world is on you, that somehow this dark cloud is on you and that there's no escaping from it. Because there are times when it feels like the darkness cannot be escaped. And yet, in complete darkness, you turn on a light and it illuminates. You know, this morning we're going to be looking at this passage, Matthew chapter 2, verse 2. I'm going to ask all of us to read it together in the count of three, whatever language you want, all right? So let's read together aloud on the count of three. 1, 2, 3.
Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him.
So some of you might be familiar. This is in Matthew chapter 2. And in this particular time in history, this is when a group of people have called them wise men, magi, maybe royal astrologers, depending on which translation you're looking at. But there's this group that came because they saw this star. They saw the star and they knew what to do somehow. They saw the star and they went to it, right? In this particular verse it says, they went to Jerusalem, which was the capital of Israel, and they went there to ask this question. Because somehow they associated this star with the King of the Jews. And so where would the king be? The king would be in the capital city. So then they went to Jerusalem and they went and asked, where is this newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star and we've come to worship him. Now this morning we're not going to do an in-depth look at Matthew chapter 2. But rather we're just going to highlight this idea of this star. Now it's interesting what the star is meant to be, or at least what the star is meant to do. Some people have tried to figure out, well, what exactly is a star in the first place? There have been different explanations, right? Some people have said that, the star that illuminated Bethlehem, that drew these wise men, that drew these magi. Some people have said that it's like a supernova. It might have been a supernova that exploded and all of a sudden there's this bright light that they were drawn to. Some people have said that's what this star was. Some people have said that this is actually a comet that was going across. In fact, they associated this one comet sighting that was about 5 BC that was actually seen in China. And then some people thought that this was actually the star that we're referring to. Some people have suggested is that this is actually a lining of Jupiter and Saturn. And that the way that their paths crossed in the sky made it look like this really bright star. Again, these are different things that people have tried to rationalize as what this star is. Some people have suggested it's just a supernatural thing. That might have actually been an angel that looked like a star guiding them. Again, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily what this is that's the issue. It's the fact that somehow this particular light drew these wise men to a place that was several, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, and led them to this one place that no one would have noticed. In some cases, no one would have cared to notice. But what drew them in the first place? Like where would they have even gotten this idea from? Let's skip back about 1,400 years. So about 1400 BC, quick little history lesson. 1400 BC, this is a time when this group called the Israelites that God had brought out of Egypt, and God said, I'm going to bring you to I'm going to bring you to the promised land, the space that I'm going to give you to establish this really nation called Israel. Not for the sake of itself, but for the sake that it would be a blessing to the world. So around 1400 BC is when Moses leads this group, and because of their disbelief of what God can do, they basically went wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, if you read in the book of Numbers, chapter around 22 to 24, you read about how this is part in their history when they're about to head from this wilderness, starting to head up north to where this promised land is meant to be. Now, I know this map isn't the greatest map, but if you kind of look here, so on the western part, that is the Mediterranean Sea. They're coming up from the south, all right? And then at that time, there were a couple of nations that were already in that land. You see the bottom right, there's a group called the Moabites, and then kind of like the surrounding part are called the Amorites. Now what happens is that as God is leading these people from the south into the promised land, God starts giving them this territory. In fact, there's this one part in chapter 22 and 23 where the king of Moab hears about how this group called the Israelites are coming, and they're actually starting to defeat the Amorites. The Amorites were actually a pretty substantial nation at that time. And they hear about how this group called the Israelites are coming up, and they're starting to take over different parts of the Amorites. And so the king of Moab is starting to get afraid. And so he actually goes and sends for this prophet, this guy named Balaam, right? And now, Balaam's not a donkey, but he's associated with this idea of a donkey, right? Because Balaam, the king of Moab comes and says, I want you to curse the Israelites. And at first, Balaam was like, well, let me talk to God first. And then God basically tells him, go with them. Now, as part of that, the thing is that every time Balaam was about to say something over the Israelites, it became a blessing, not a curse. And the king of Moab says, well, no, I want you to curse them. He's like, well, I can't just say anything. And so every time he says something over the Israelites, it becomes a blessing, not a curse. Now, as part of that, in Numbers chapter 20, verse 4, verse 17, this is what it says. It says, I see him, but not here and now. I perceive him far in the distant future. A star will rise from Jacob. A scepter will emerge from Israel. So as part of that blessing, there was this promise. There was this promise that there would be the star that would rise from Jacob. And this would be associated with the king. Now, how this prophecy, how this promise gets passed on for the generations and generations, we're not sure. I mean, Scripture is one way. This is part of what was called the Torah. This is the first 5 books of what we know as the Bible. And with this was passed down through generation. So this particular promise was also part of that passing down from generation. Now, how does it get from these group called the Israelites over to these other people somewhere in the east? And again, there's been different speculations about what this means. One of the suggestions, again, this is speculation, this is not necessarily rooted in history, at least it's not very objectively rooted in history. But one of the speculations is that, when the Babylonians came and took over the Israelites, and they took a bunch of them, including people like Daniel, off towards Babylon, Daniel would have taken with him all his knowledge. His group would have taken all this understanding that they would have learned as kids growing up over into Babylon. And speculation is, could it be that somehow this promise was passed on to someone there? And all of a sudden they see a star. They see a star and they know what it was about. Somehow they knew where to go. Somehow they knew what this meant. And in fact, as they head into this, that's why they come. And they say, where is the newborn king? Because we have come to worship him. Which to me still baffles my mind. How is it that these group of people who are not necessarily part of God's chosen nation, but somehow they heard about some promise that was over 1,400 years ago potentially, and that with that they knew that somehow something like this would be associated with the King of the Jews. Not just the King of the Jews, but the one who was meant to be worshipped. It wasn't just any king, but this particular king who had a promise attached to him. And for some reason it drew them to go thousands of miles west into this place that ultimately, when you read later on, they figure out that it goes to Bethlehem, and they end up in this little town of Bethlehem, which really, it's kind of like saying, have you ever been to like Listowel, Ontario? Right? Some of you have, but it's not exactly a destination place for most people. And yet they were drawn. They were drawn to this place because they knew here somehow is not just the King of the Jews, but the one who is worthy of their worship. The fact is that this light drew them to Jesus. It brought them to Jesus because ultimately he is the light of the world. In fact, he says this later on in John chapter 8. He actually says, he makes the proclamation, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't walk in darkness because you will have the light that leads to life. And somehow they knew that this star would bring them to the one who is worthy of worship. And the one who is worthy of worship says that he is the light of the world. And that even though you feel this darkness, he is the one that can lead you to life. But it doesn't stop there. In fact, in one of his sermons, he says this too. In fact, one of the things that even last week, one of the things that Pastor David reminded us of is that Jesus is the source. Jesus is the head. Jesus is supreme. That he is the one where everything flows out of. He is the light. He is the source. In fact, I invite you, go back and listen to that sermon again. So he is the light of the world. He makes that proclamation. And with that, because there was this light that was a star that drew them to Bethlehem, to this very child who would one day make this claim that he is the light of the world, that no one else is, that he is. But then he says this. He then in a sermon says to you, to us, you are the light of the world. A city on a hilltop cannot be hidden. Just like in that completely dark room when you turn that light on and all of a sudden it illuminates and you're drawn to it and that becomes the focal point. He then says, you are the light of the world. Not that you are becoming the source. He's not saying that. But rather, just as the sun is the source and that the moon is really a reflection of that light, Jesus, who is the king and is the light of the world, then says to us, essentially, you now reflect my light back to the people around you. That's his call to us. Now, some of you, maybe you're feeling, maybe for some of you, you're feeling like, that you're not, you can't, for a variety of reasons. Maybe right now, as I was mentioning earlier, maybe you're feeling that darkness, and it feels heavy. Some of you are experiencing anxieties and depression and frustration I could not imagine. And maybe in the midst of that, you're thinking to yourself, how can I be the light of the world? The thing is that God never actually says you have to be perfect to be the light of the world. Because he says, even back in John chapter 8, when you follow me, I will lead you from the darkness. Doesn't mean that it will be perfect. Doesn't mean that all of a sudden the darkness is completely gone. Because right now we are living in a world where darkness and light keeps on fighting each other over and over again. Well, the powers of darkness want to prevail. They want to push through. They want to surround you to the point where you don't see the light anymore. And yet, even in the darkness, that light that Jesus has, it can still break through. It may not feel like it sometimes, but it still breaks through. And he says, if you follow me, I will lead you to life. So the first call is, will you let him lead you? Will you let him guide you out of the darkness that may not be completely pushed away yet, because we're still in this battle with the world of what that means. But over and over again, Jesus says, let me draw you, let me draw you, let me draw you. Let me bring you back into my light, he says. And with that, then, he says, then reflect that to the people around you. The other thing, too, is that sometimes, if you don't, maybe you remember back in July, we actually talked a little bit about this, right? When we talked about those 5 markers, one of the things that we said was, in the 5th marker, I'm not gonna pop quiz you on this, all right? Don't worry about this. You can always go back and take a look at this. But the 5th marker is, what does it mean to serve those outside our walls? In other words, what does it mean to be the light of Christ outside to others? I mean, that's one of our markers. That's one of the questions that we ask. How are we serving? How are we bringing the light of Christ to the people around us? And so with that, then, I know that sometimes we think about this and we're like, I know for some of you, some of us, it's hard. Because now you're putting yourself out there a bit, right? Now you're kind of, in a sense, you're being, dare I say, vulnerable, a little bit exposed, to actually say, hey, Jesus is the light of the world. Would you want to know more? Or can I show you? Or sometimes some people I know, it's a little bit, it feels a little bit frightening. You know, recently, this one guy named Rich Birch who has a podcast called Unseminary, and this is one of the comments he makes. He says, a staggering 86% of first-time guests start with a personal invitation. 86%. Now, 10% if it's a special event, 8% if they see something online. So again, the special event, the online stuff, that's fine. But at the end of the day, the one reason why a person will walk into the doors of a church is if someone personally invites them. Now again, some of you might be saying that and go, well, okay, I don't know. I don't even know how to do that, right? It feels kind of weird. I know that sometimes growing up, especially in a church setting, I remember one of the questions that I really got annoyed by sometimes, especially when I went to some of these youth conferences and stuff, every so often someone would ask me, how many people did you win to Jesus? And I used to hate that question. Because to me, this idea of winning people to Jesus, I almost felt like a used car salesman. If you sell cars, I'm not trying to say that that's a bad thing. But sometimes we have this negative connotation, right? Of this somehow, you're trying to make the deal happen, right? You're trying to close the deal. And it used to feel so weird because I was like, is this what it means to be someone who witnesses? Is this what it means to evangelize, that you need to close the deal somehow? And I used to feel weird about that. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about this kind of your objective, right? It's not like we get together once in a while and we say, okay, what are your sales targets? How many people are you reaching, right? We got to hit another 5% quota in order to hit that. No, we're not doing that. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's not about how many people are we bringing in, right? It's not people, how many people are you winning, because that's not what Jesus is trying to do. He's not trying to win people. He's trying to draw them out of the darkness so that they might see the light. And with that then is that what does it mean then for us to draw people towards Jesus? Again, I'm going to refer back to something Pastor David said on October 26th. I remind you can go back to that sermon as well. One of the things that he references was this thing called the angle scale. And this was an idea of, okay, what does a person's potential progression towards Jesus look like? Again, this is not linear. This is not like you finish step 1, go to step 2, but rather this is just a way to see, okay, where could a person be at? Because some people, maybe they've never heard of Jesus at all, or maybe they just know Jesus as a curse word, right? And so they have no clue who Jesus is. Maybe the first step for them is, oh, there's actually someone named Jesus? Interesting. And so depending on where they are in their journey, part of that then is that what does it mean to invite them to be a part of the journey you're already on? The Apostle Paul reminds us of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Because some of the people in the church in Corinth were arguing about who do they follow. I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow some other guy, right? And one of the things that Paul reminds them of is that sometimes, because we associate based on people we resonate with, and yet Paul says to them, it's not about following one person or another, right? He says, Paul, I planted seeds in your heart, Paul's watered it, but God is the one who made it grow. At the end of the day, it's not about the thing is that we all have different parts in this. What does it mean then for the people that God has brought you to connect with? How do you then see where they are in their journey, and what is God already doing in their life? And then inviting them into something that is deeper than maybe what they anticipated. So maybe a couple of things that you want to consider, even for yourself. First one is this: why? Why do you come in the first place? In the next 5 weeks, we're going to have different opportunities to gather, especially around the Christmas message. We're going to have different opportunities for us to actually dig into what does it mean that Jesus is shining his light in the dark world. And you're going to have an opportunity to actually invite others to be a part of this. Remember, again, 86%. If you ask someone, they're 86% more likely to actually come with you than if they just saw something online. If we just put out an advertisement or something, they're less likely to come in because of that. They're more likely to come in because you actually ask them. And not just ask them, hey, I'm going to a church service, you want to come, but why are you here? You know, next week is our first one on hope. Why do you want to be here? Is there something about Jesus shining his hope in the dark world that somehow resonates with you, or somehow draws you, or somehow drives you? Maybe there's something in that. Next Sunday night, old-fashioned Christmas carol, or old-fashioned Christmas night. Why do you want to come here? I'm hoping that part of it is because it's an opportunity for us as a church to celebrate Jesus together through some music, through decorating the tree, all that fun stuff, and say, hey, do you want to come with me to check it out? For you to come alongside them, not just, hey, come on out and then they're going to sit somewhere and that's it. No, come with me so that we can experience it together. Because I want to share why I want to come, and hopefully this will be a reason why you might want to come. But with that then, it gives an opportunity to even at least try to understand, well, what is happening there? What is God already leading them towards? Maybe these are some questions. And again, this is a little bit hard to see. This will be in that email going out tomorrow as part of the follow-up. Now, the first one is this, right? This Christmas, our church is inviting people to consider what changes if Jesus is actually the light of the world. What do you think would change, if anything? Maybe that's a question you ask. Another question, potentially, I'd like you to check out our Christmas cantata on December 14th and discuss what made sense or maybe what didn't. So you're inviting them to actually consider, not just come and experience, but maybe seeing what is God already starting to bubble up in them. And maybe there are certain things that make sense, maybe some things that they still have questions about. And you being there gives them an opportunity to at least try to unpack some of that as much as they want to. Some people say it's a dark world out there. What would actually change if Jesus really is the light of the world? Maybe they never considered that question in the first place. Maybe they say nothing. Maybe they say nothing will change. Okay, help me understand that. And there could be some reasons. Whether you agree with it or not is a different story, but there could be some other reasons that now at least helps you understand, oh, this is why they think that, or this is what their approach is, this is what their posture is. Our pastors are sharing ideas about Jesus and Christmas. I'd like to hear your opinion about them, including your critiques and disagreements. Feel free to say, that short Chinese guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm fine with that. But that's the thing, it gives you an opportunity to let them express, or at least try to see what exactly, are there things that maybe Jesus is bubbling to the surface, but maybe there are other things that are like, no, that makes no sense at all. Or no, I don't agree with that part. Or maybe this part is kind of okay, but that part, what he said, that makes no sense. Whatever it could be. This is the thing, it gives you an opportunity to have that conversation. Right? And it's not like they're not necessarily attacking you, they're going at me, which is fine. But it gives you an opportunity to then help them see. And again, these are not the only questions. These are just some examples. You can, whatever way you want to approach this, whatever questions that maybe God is drawing out of you to see what is happening in their life, that's the key here. It's not just inviting them here, but then having that conversation afterwards. Letting them share both maybe things that don't make sense, or maybe things that they doubt, or maybe things that they're opposing big time on. Or maybe there are some things that they go, you know what, I never thought of that. Or maybe I've never considered that. Or maybe I need to think on that more, right? And that's Jesus drawing them out of the darkness into his light. So this is the challenge over the next few weeks. Is that as we begin to look at what does it mean to shine Jesus' light, Jesus' hope, Jesus' peace, Jesus' joy, Jesus' love in a dark world. My challenge to you over the next few weeks is who is that one or two or whatever number of people that God has already brought in your sphere of influence who maybe have never stepped foot into a church before. Maybe they have before and they've been resistant against it. And you know what? Whether they want to step into here or whether you even want, maybe they don't feel comfortable stepping into here. And for some people, I get that. This is one of the reasons why we keep the online stuff available. Maybe you just want to watch it together and say, hey, let's just watch it together. I'm just curious what your opinion is. And again, maybe they might watch this particular sermon and go, what is this short Asian guy talking about, right? I don't know. Or maybe there's something else that draws them out of the darkness and into the light. In fact, next week, I think we're still doing this for the old-fashioned Christmas night, is that little take-home thing. There's a little take-home thing. A little take-home thing. That's a teaser for next Sunday night, so you'll have to find out more about that then. But this is part of it. During this Christmas season, as you, and for some of you, maybe during this time is when it kind of gets a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more stressful, a little bit more busy because of all the other things. But even in the midst of that, when you come here, why? What is it that draws you here? And then when it draws you here, will you invite other people to be drawn here or to whatever other church they're going to as well? If you want to go with them to a different church for a week or two because it's something, maybe they resonate more there, I'm fine with that. How are they being brought into Jesus' light? Because he says over and over again, I am the light of the world. And if you follow me, I will bring you out of darkness into a life of light. So before we continue on in worship, I'm going to give you a moment. Maybe even right now, there's someone whose face pops in your mind. And I'm going to ask you to consider, what does it mean for you to invite them into Jesus' light? Whether it's bringing them here on a Sunday, whether it's connecting with them somewhere else and saying, hey, here's some of the things that our church does, what do you think? Or maybe it's a conversation that says, Jesus says this, what do you think? Whatever that might be, I'm going to invite you to consider, who is that person that you want to shine Jesus' light to so that they would be drawn from the darkness into a light of life. So take a moment in the silence to pray over that, and then Jan will continue to lead us through worship.